Kevin Schofield over at SCC Insight. Kevin wrote something yesterday on his blog on SCC Insight here, and I'll actually bring it up. This is what the Supreme Court did yesterday. It says here, a footnote to history: the state Supreme Court tries to repair a past harm to Black lives. And man, this story is crazy because what it's all about is in 1960, and especially for people who might sit and think that, we tell this story, people talk about liberal Seattle and everything else. Well, in 1960, the way this story goes here is there was a family, and it was Mr. and Mrs. Price. And Mr. and Mrs. Price, back in 1960, they went to a cemetery and to bury their infant child. Their child had died as an infant. And there was an area of the cemetery that was set aside that was called Babyland. And they wanted to bury their baby in Babyland where other infants were buried. Well, the cemetery owners said Babyland was restricted for white babies only. This is here. This is Seattle in 1960. And insult to injury, though, because these guys, the Price family, was like, not only are they trying to bury their child, they buried the child somewhere else, and they took it to court. And they was like, damn, even in death, here in Seattle, the area of the cemetery for babies was segregated, right? They took this thing to court, and basically the Supreme Court of the state of Washington at the time, because there was a law in the books. The law said, like, look, man, you can't segregate in a funeral cemetery, can't segregate. There was a RCW, a Revised Codes of Washington. So it was a law in the state of Washington, right? And the cemetery took, this case, they went to the Supreme Court, and what the Supreme Court said was that law that bound integration basically in the cemetery was invalid, right? 60 years ago, they found on the side of the cemetery that segregated and said that this black baby couldn't be buried in Babyland, and that ruling sat on the books for 60 years. And basically, what it said was that in that law, there's 57 things that talk about cemetery regulations. Maybe, a coffin has to be this size, they have to be this far apart, this and that. And one thing in it that talked about basically civil rights. And so when they went to the Supreme Court, when they went there in 1960, they were like, well, there's two things in this law. And so basically they invalidated it. Well, come to this case with Tim Eyman. 60 years later, in I-976, the Supreme Court, in doing their research on past precedents, came across this case from 60 years ago, and they took the opportunity here to, in the exact words, they put a footnote. And by the way, the main justice at that time, 60 years ago, Justice Mallory, was like basically, he was known racist. He absolutely did not like black people at all, right? They put a footnote here, the state Supreme Court did, and let me find it. The footnote, 60 years later, state Supreme Court says, we must remember that even the most venerable precedents must be struck down when it's incorrect and harmful. The systemic oppression of black Americans is not merely incorrect and harmful. It's shameful and deadly. 60 years ago, and people who've ever lost an infant, imagine that you lost your small child and you're just going to go to try to bury your child in a cemetery where other babies, and what they tell you at the time is that this is for white babies only. 60 years later. So.
Whew, what a story. Oh, and honestly, what a way to feel like, wow, that's what it took. It took the 60 years for someone to be able to see this and think this needs to be rectified. That's what we're dealing with here, where we understand that There are a lot of ingrained ideas. They are in bed in this system. They are built of the system. And that is forever to see justice in a case like that.
I mean, when you talk about systemic, when you talk about this, that was the state precedent. That was that you know what I'm saying. That I'm in. So whether you like I'm in or not, this 976 right here. It's a small footnote. It's on the last page of the ruling, on the 13th page, and everything else. And that's why it's important to read these things all the way through. And big shout out to Kevin Schofield, SCC Insight. If you guys want to see this article in full, go to sccinsight.com and you'll hear the whole thing. But I mean, if you can imagine 60 years ago trying to bury your infant and you go to the cemetery and they say no black babies allowed. And this is right here in Seattle, Washington. In our history is our history. And we don't talk about these things to make people uncomfortable. We talk about these things because we got to embrace our history of who we are as a city and our shared experience and how we go through them.
Absolutely. And the only way we actually learn is by looking back. We talk about the Sankofa method. You got to look back to know how to move forward. And this is exactly what, this example provides us. If we don't understand a lot of the historical systemic racism that's been buried into so many covenants within Seattle and throughout King County, that we are going to set ourselves up for a disservice, as we try to think about shaping and reforming change. We really do have to learn from those past, some of them atrocities, unfortunately. Oh,
Again, you can read more about it at sccinsight.com. We're gonna take an early break. We'll be right back. You're watching the morning.